First, let's establish how do you even classify what your training status is. Well, there is no single indicator of what your training status is, but there are some general characteristics which are commonly seen among lifters at different stages of their lifting careers. Beginners are pretty easy to identify because they are clearly new to lifting. Beginners see rapid strength and muscle gain, usually being able to progress in some capacity every time they perform the same workout. The beginner stage starts when you begin lifting and lasts somewhere around 6 months to 1 year of consistent training depending on your specific routine. The intermediate phase is next. This is where lifters no longer see weekly progression in muscle growth or strength. Instead, it takes multiple weeks or up to a month to achieve any noticeable muscle growth or strength gains. The intermediate phase begins once your beginner phase ends and lasts around 3 to 6 years of consistent training depending on your training routine. And then we reach the advanced stage, which is where we spend the majority of our lifting career if you lift for a long period of time. The advanced stage is where muscle and strength gains take multiple months and years to achieve. This essentially lasts from the time you finish your intermediate phase to the rest of your lifting career. However, this theoretical framework assumes that you are training consistently with a highly effective training routine for your entire lifting career. In reality, this is often not the case since we sometimes take time off from lifting or maybe perform a less than ideal training routine. So instead of being a strict time-dependent variable, lifters will probably shift between phases at different times throughout their lifting careers. For example, if a highly advanced lifter took time off training for a few months before returning back to lifting, they will probably see progress at the rate of a beginner for a short while. Or if a lifter suddenly increased the volume and intensity of their training, they might experience growth at a faster rate for a temporary period of time. Furthermore, these phases are not a global classification. What this means is that some muscle groups might be slightly more or less advanced than others, depending on how they have been trained. Generally, the muscles that are prioritized, in other words, trained with more volume, a higher intensity, with more exercises and more frequently, are going to be of a higher training status. Comparatively, the muscles which are de-emphasized, in other words, trained with less volume, a lower intensity, fewer exercises, and less frequently, are going to be of a lower training status. So if you were to train different muscles in a similar way, you might actually experience growth at a faster or slower rate between different muscle groups in the same lifter. We should also be aware that our training status isn't the only predictive factor of muscle size. This is true when compared between lifters and between different muscle groups on the same lifter. Someone could be more muscular as a beginner than another person who is categorized as advanced, simply due to genetics. Furthermore, most people usually have naturally more and less developed muscles relative to the rest of their physique. So even if a weaker muscle group is trained with more volume and intensity, it might still not be as well developed as a different muscle group which is naturally stronger, despite not being trained with as much intent. Although when comparing the same lifter or the same muscle group over time, we can then say that a higher training status means a larger muscle. So the point to make here is that training status is not so much about how big or strong someone is, and it isn't even about how long you have been lifting for. It is more about what rate we can see muscle growth at. Although that being said, if you train for a long time, chances are that you will end up being stronger and more muscular anyway. So how does training status influence how different training principles are applied? Well, there are two key principles that might be implemented differently based on your level of advancement. The first important principle is our threshold for adaptation. This refers to how much total training stimulus is required to elicit any amount of muscle growth. If we don't meet this threshold, we simply don't build muscle mass. We might do enough to maintain muscle size, but to continue building muscle, we need to surpass this threshold. Essentially, as we become more advanced, our threshold for adaptation increases. This means we require a greater training stimulus to build muscle. As a beginner, the threshold for adaptation is so low that essentially any form of resistance training will usually be enough to produce significant growth. This is because beginners are completely unaccustomed to lifting, so any lifting is more than they are used to. Intermediates are now familiar with resistance training, so their threshold for adaptation is higher. This means they are required to produce a greater overall training stimulus to provide an adaptation. And advanced lifters have an even higher threshold for adaptation, so they require an even greater training stimulus to produce muscle growth. Although sometimes it can be difficult to know if you are surpassing this threshold as an advanced lifter because progress is so slow that it takes multiple months and years to actually see performance or physique changes. So how do we increase our training stimulus as we become more advanced? Well, the primary way in which we achieve this is via progressive overload. By this we are referring to performing more reps and/or load over time. This is what allows us to keep making progress from a short-term perspective. As we perform more reps and load, we provide a superior hypertrophy training stimulus. This training stimulus produces muscle growth as an adaptation. And because our muscle is bigger, we can perform slightly more reps or load. And this provides an even greater training stimulus, and so on. So technically, you could perform the same training routine from day one in the gym and become an advanced lifter just by performing more reps and load over the years. However, this only makes you an advanced lifter within the constraints of that specific training program. If we were to manipulate some other variables, we could probably see a faster rate of growth even as an advanced lifter, which would technically make us not an advanced lifter anymore. So let's now discuss how different training variables might be implemented based on your individual training status. There are 4 primary variables that might differ slightly between beginner, intermediate, and advanced lifters. The first of which is volume, more specifically the number of sets a muscle group is trained with per week. From what we currently understand, volume tends to follow a diminishing returns relationship with hypertrophy. In other words, more volume is usually better for muscle growth, but has less additional benefit as more sets are performed. To put some numbers on it, let's look at these 2 studies. First, let's look at this meta-analysis which aimed to assess the influence of volume on muscle growth. With the available evidence, it was found that higher volumes seem to have an almost linear positive effect on muscle growth. However, as we can see, the categories that the data was grouped into were on the lower end of the volume spectrum. So to supplement this meta-analysis, let's look at this systematic review which aimed to assess the influence of moderate versus high weekly volumes on muscle growth. The researchers analysed studies which compared moderate volume training, defined as training a muscle with 12 to 20 sets per week, versus high volume training, defined as training a muscle with more than 20 sets per week. Of the 7 studies included in the analysis, there was enough data to assess results for the quadriceps, biceps, and triceps muscles. It was found that there was a trend favouring high volume training for all 3 muscles, but it was only considered statistically significant for the triceps. So going back to our volume hypertrophy relationship graph, most people would probably expect to see significant diminishing returns when training a muscle with more than around 20 sets per week. Although this is an average number and might be slightly different between each individual. So what does this mean when it comes to training status? Well, here are some general guidelines as to how volume might be prescribed at different levels of advancement. For beginners, even very low volume training will be sufficient to produce muscle growth. This is because their baseline volume is 0, so anything greater than this will be enough to result in a significant stimulus. Beginners can still train with higher volumes if they want to see an even faster rate of growth, but it is certainly not essential to achieve a good stimulus. Intermediates would likely benefit from increasing volume beyond their beginner stage. This is an easy way to increase the training stimulus to continue seeing muscle growth once progress has started to slow down. At this stage, most lifters would probably want to be training any high priority muscles with at least around 10 direct sets per week if the goal is to maximize muscle growth. And for advanced lifters, volume can be adjusted based on priority. Depending on your specific muscle development, you might want to train high priority muscles with more volume and low priority muscles with less volume. This is because we don't have infinite time and energy to train all muscles with high volumes, so we might need to be more strategic with where we allocate volume. Advanced lifters usually need to train high priority muscles with at least 15 sets per week to produce an effective enough stimulus to continue building muscle. The next variable that might differ between beginner versus advanced lifters is proximity to failure. In most cases, training closer to failure tends to produce greater muscle growth compared with not training to failure. This was seen in this meta-regression, which aimed to assess the relationship between proximity to failure and muscle growth. Overall, the analysis found an exponential positive effect for proximity to failure and muscle growth. In other words, as we train closer to failure, we see greater additional hypertrophy. Although it should also be noted that significant muscle growth is often seen when training very far from failure too, as much as 10 reps in reserve. And it seems that training closer to failure tends to be more beneficial for advanced lifters compared with beginners. This was seen in this meta-analysis, which compared the effects of training to failure versus not to failure on muscle growth. The overall body of evidence found a slight trend favouring training to failure, but this wasn't considered statistically significant. However, a subgroup analysis found that training to failure had a significant positive effect for more advanced lifters, but not for untrained lifters. So what this suggests is that beginners probably don't need to train all that close to failure to see significant muscle growth. They can train close to failure and will probably benefit slightly from it, but it isn't essential and could potentially ingrain some bad technique habits too. So as a general guide, beginners can probably train with 5 reps in reserve or fewer to see great muscle growth. Intermediate lifters will probably benefit more from training closer to failure, since they require a greater stimulus. These lifters can probably see great growth with 3 reps in reserve or fewer. And for advanced lifters, any small additional stimulus is required to elicit an adaptation. Furthermore, advanced lifters have also developed more skill in how to train a muscle closer to true muscular failure, while maximally stressing a specific muscle group. Advanced lifters should probably be training closer to failure to ensure they are maximizing the stimulus of each set, at least around 2 reps in reserve in most cases. Furthermore, advanced lifters might benefit from some post-failure training techniques, such as drop sets, rest pause, and partial reps. This can help them accumulate more total work when the muscles are in a highly fatigued state, which in theory might have some additional benefits for muscle growth. The next training variable that will likely differ based on training status is exercise selection. Overall, muscle growth can be achieved using a large variety of different exercises, and there aren't necessarily any best exercises. This was established in this meta-analysis, which compared the effects of free weights versus machines. Overall, both machines and free weights were found to be effective for muscle growth, with no significant benefit favouring either exercise type. This suggests that it is not the specific exercise that our muscle responds to, it is stress and tension which causes the adaptation. So even though muscle growth can be achieved using a variety of different exercises, we might preference certain exercises over others based on training status. Beginners usually benefit from more easy to perform and convenient exercises. This is because they haven't yet developed great technique, and anything they do will result in significant muscle growth. Beginners should mostly focus on being consistent in the gym rather than worrying too much about exercise selection. For intermediate lifters, more free weight compound exercises are often a good idea. This is because these lifters still have good growth potential, so training more muscle groups simultaneously is usually enough to produce growth, even in accessory muscles. This can make training more efficient, as we can train more muscles with each exercise and still produce decent growth. And for advanced lifters, they have already built most of the muscle mass they can, so any further gains are going to require a more intense training stimulus. For these lifters, more specialized exercises, which maximally stress a particular muscle group, are usually going to be more beneficial. In general, exercises with the following characteristics are going to achieve this. Those which ensure the target muscle is the limiter of each set, those which allow greater movement of relevant joints but have more stability at other joints, those which train the target muscle in a more stretched position, and those which are most difficult in the lengthened range of an exercise. For example, a primary squat pattern for a beginner might be a leg press. For an intermediate, this might transition to a back squat, and for an advanced lifter, this might be a heel-elevated Smith machine squat to maximally stress the quads while minimizing systemic fatigue. And the last important training variable to consider is lifting technique. The fundamentals of lifting technique for hypertrophy training remain the same for lifters at all levels of advancement. This includes lifting with fairly strict technique, using a controlled eccentric tempo, and training through a full range of motion. However, we might want to modify technique slightly based on our training status. For beginners, they simply need to learn how to perform the lift. This means learning the motor pattern and developing the coordination required to execute the exercise. Depending on the individual and their exercise history, it might take a longer or shorter duration to develop adequate lifting skill. At the intermediate stage, this is where technique should be emphasized to a greater degree. These lifters should focus on mastering the fundamental lifting techniques as previously mentioned. This will set them up to be able to effectively perform almost any standard hypertrophy exercise in the gym. While standard good lifting technique is going to be perfectly adequate to train for muscle growth, advanced lifters might start to implement slightly more specialized training techniques. This might help them provide a slightly greater training stimulus that might be required to continue building muscle. Some advanced lifting techniques include lifting through a movement path that suits their individual anatomy, performing partial reps in the lengthened position for exercises where it makes sense, slowing tempo to a greater degree in the lengthened position, minimizing the use of the stretch shortening cycle on relevant lifts, and potentially using a little momentum on some lifts to improve the resistance profile where necessary. Another important concept which may change how we train over time is due to individual variability. We generally discuss the average findings of evidence, but not everyone responds exactly the same to all training variables. Most people respond similarly, and chances are that you respond pretty similarly too. However, some people might find that training slightly different to the norm tends to produce a superior stimulus compared with what is traditionally recommended. For example, this study explored the individual response to training with different rep ranges. Trainees performed 3 sets of leg press, leg extensions, leg curls, and calf raises 3 times per week for 24 weeks. Half the subjects trained with 8 to 12 reps for the first 12 weeks, followed by training with 27 to 31 reps for the following 12 weeks. The other half performed the same rep ranges in the opposite order. After the initial 12 weeks and after 24 weeks, thigh muscle growth was very similar between the groups, as we would expect. However, the individual differences between subjects were not all the same. These data points show the higher responders after the first 12 weeks, meaning those who saw greater than average muscle growth. Once they transitioned to the second training phase using different rep ranges, most of them saw less muscle growth compared with the first phase. And on the other hand, this graph shows the low responders after the first 12 weeks, meaning those who saw less muscle growth than average. Once they transitioned to the second training phase using a different rep range, most of them saw much greater muscle growth. And this is likely to be the case for other training variables too. As a beginner, we don't necessarily need to find the optimal training methods just yet. And you don't really know how you respond to training either, so you can't really individualize training variables anyway. Again, anything will work fairly well as a beginner, so just focus on performing a routine that you can stick with consistently. Intermediates should probably start to train with what resembles effective training based on the average findings of research and anecdotes. This is because you are most likely to respond fairly similar to others, so it is the best place to start. And for advanced lifters, this is where greater individual variation in training might be more appropriate. Advanced lifters have trained for a longer time frame and know more about how they respond to different forms of training. These lifters might achieve a slightly superior stimulus by selecting specific exercises that suit their individual anatomy with a technique that suits them, training in rep ranges that give them a greater perceived stimulus, and allocating more or less volume to different muscle groups. And the last important factor to consider in the training status discussion is a nutrition variable, and that is energy balance. Typically, a calorie surplus is recommended to maximize our rate of muscle growth. And this is probably true at all levels of advancement. However, the magnitude of the calorie surplus should probably change at different stages throughout your lifting career. In most cases, beginners starting out at a healthy body fat level can likely benefit from a larger surplus. This was seen in this study, which explored the effects of a large calorie surplus on body composition changes in untrained men. 73 untrained men performed a 4-time per week resistance training program for 8 weeks. In addition to their regular training and their normal diet, one group was provided with a 2010 calorie supplement containing 356 grams of carbohydrates, 106 grams of protein, and 18 grams of fat. The second group was provided with a supplement of the same calorie value, but just with more carbohydrates and less protein. And the third group received no supplementation, they just consumed their regular habitual diet. As expected, the two groups receiving supplementation gained significant body weight, around 3 kilograms or 7 pounds, while the no supplement group roughly maintained body weight. In terms of body composition, all groups gained significant muscle mass with greater gains in the supplement groups, and none of the groups gained any significant body fat, with the non-supplement group actually losing some fat. So the two groups who were in a significant calorie surplus essentially gained exclusively muscle mass with no body fat gain. However, we don't typically see the same outcomes with more advanced lifters. For example, this study compared the effects of eating at maintenance versus a surplus on body composition changes in trained lifters. 17 lifters with at least 1 year of resistance training experience and who could bench press at least 1 times or 0.7 times body weight for males and females respectively, and who could squat at least 1.5 or 1.25 times body weight for men and women respectively, were included in the study. Subjects lifted 3 times per week for 8 weeks with a hypertrophy-focused training routine targeting the full body. One group was assigned to maintain their body weight within a plus or minus 1% range. Another group were assigned to gain weight by around 0.5% body weight per week, and the third group were assigned to gain weight by around 1.5% body weight per week. And all participants were instructed to consume a protein intake of at least 1.8 grams per kilogram per day. After 8 weeks, the maintenance group successfully maintained body weight within the required range. However, both the small and larger surplus groups gained a similar amount of body weight, indicating that the small surplus group didn't quite adhere to their required calorie intake. In any case, there were no clear differences in muscle thickness changes between either of the groups. However, skin fold measurements were also taken at various different sites on the body, which is an indicator of body fat. The sum of skin folds decreased slightly in the maintenance group, but increased by more than 10% in both the surplus groups. So what this means is that our relative energy balance might differ based on training status. Beginners starting out in a fairly lean and healthy state can probably afford to eat in a more aggressive calorie surplus and gain mostly muscle mass, whereas advanced lifters would probably see a much lower proportion of muscle growth with the same surplus, and therefore gain mostly body fat. As a general rule, beginners can benefit from gaining up to around 1% of body weight per week. Intermediate lifters can benefit from gaining up to around 0.5% of body weight per week, and advanced lifters probably won't see much additional benefit from gaining more than around 0.25% of body weight per week. Also, just be aware that if your priority is to reduce body fat, then a calorie deficit is going to be more appropriate than a surplus at any level of advancement. So taking all this into consideration, let's now establish some practical recommendations. First of all, training status is determined by your rate of muscle growth, not necessarily someone's overall muscularity or how long they have been lifting for. This means that your training status might shift between phases at different times and might differ between muscle groups on the same person. As we become more advanced, the training stimulus required to produce muscle growth increases. We can increase the training stimulus in the short term via progressing load and reps within our current training program. Furthermore, we can also adjust the overall stimulus of the training program via manipulating different variables. Beginners can usually see significant growth with low volume training and training further from failure. Furthermore, it is usually more appropriate for them to implement easy to perform exercises and focus on learning the basic movement patterns of each exercise. Intermediate lifters can usually benefit from moderate to high volume training and training closer to failure. These lifters might want to train with more free weight compound lifts and to make sure they are lifting with strict full range of motion with a controlled eccentric tempo. And for advanced lifters, training specific muscle groups with higher volumes and training closer to true muscular failure are generally going to be necessary to make significant gains. Advanced lifters might want to implement more specialized exercises which maximally stress a specific muscle group. They will also likely benefit from some more advanced lifting techniques, such as lifting through a more individualized movement path, using lengthened partials, or using some momentum to improve the resistance profile of the lift. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.